It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This episode is brought to you by HP. Whenever you do your best thinking, the HP Spectre X360 is ready when inspiration strikes. With power save for battery life and focus mode to multitask, you can do your best thinking whenever and wherever it happens. The HP Spectre X360 2-in-1 convertible PC with Windows 10 saves battery life for whenever an idea hits you. HP Spectre X360, a more thoughtful laptop.
You are Locked On Bama, your daily podcast on the Alabama Crimson Tide. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Jimmy Stein on Locked On Bama. Alabama tonight receiving a commitment from Kobe Prentice, wide receiver from Calera, which is just outside Birmingham. For those of you who don't know, Calera is not a 7A type power. You might not be super familiar with that program, but they do produce players. Alabama recruited a big lineman there, Jones, who ended up signing with Oregon. Y'all might remember him, gigantic defensive tackle type guy. I mean, so they've had dudes from time to time, but Kobe Prentice is their dude this year. Have a lot to say about Kobe because he's so interesting to us in the recruiting industry, because we like to think that those days in the 60s and 70s and 80s in the last century are over in terms of kids that slipped through the cracks. Back then there was no internet. There wasn't this sharing of information. And colleges could literally just stumble upon a guy who had no hype, who no football fans had heard of, and he was just a total badass. And these kids were more hidden back then. And then as the recruiting industry aged and there became a lot more armchair recruiting analysts like myself, who used to be that before I'm now this big time guy at On3. And I'm just joking when I say that. But there used to be like no one out there finding these hidden kids. And ever since, the internet comes along and now we can all share information, there's almost no hidden kids. And that's the way it's sort of been. I think a great hidden kid story for us Alabama fans was Josh Jacobs. And maybe we'll go over that soon because Josh is just one of all of our favorites. And he was almost inexplicably hidden in Tulsa, of all places. I mean, a big city that's famous for having good football players, and yet he slipped through the cracks and ended up at Alabama with very little attention. Then was a 3-and-done first-round pick, and he's been a good player in the NFL. So Kobe, sort of hidden, and I say that in the sense before any of y'all listening to this had heard of Kobe Prentice. In the 24/7 composite, he was ranked in the 40s in Alabama. And as we all know, Alabama, Crimson Tide under Nick Saban, is only generally interested in 6, 8, 10 guys in the entire state at the most. And you're probably like, why on earth is Alabama prioritizing a guy that's ranked in the 40s? Well, that says more about where he was ranked than it says about Alabama. And the fact of the matter is, this is COVID. And by that, I mean, everything got turned on its head a year ago. I mean, in terms of in the spring and summer, when these guys kind of create the hype and the rankings for themselves, there weren't camps. There weren't combines. There weren't even summer camps at the schools where information always leaks out about who they're interested in and who's good. And on top of that, so now the entire recruiting industry has to rank kids based on their junior huddle tape of their high schools. And all over the country, not everybody played a full schedule. And in Alabama, they did, sort of, but it was all weird. And every week you were missing kids. And it was just the ultimate year for the 70s, 80s, and 90s to happen all over again, where there are kids out there who are legitimately good, and they're not ranked high. And Alabama is giving us, look at these examples. Look at Amari Niblack, who Alabama got over a month ago. His ranking was low too. But have you guys seen his tape? Have you guys seen what he actually is? And then Kobe Prentice shows up at Alabama's camp this summer, because now you got camps again. He runs a 4.38 at Alabama's camp. I know more casual followers of recruiting don't really understand this, but I cannot stress to you enough how rare that is. I know every kid in the world you read a blurb about, says, oh, he runs a 4.4, his coach says he runs a 4.4. It's just not true. Just look at the Indianapolis combines, when the NFL prospects run the 40 and how many of them really are running 4.4s. There's just a lot of fiction out there, but this kid, no, he literally ran a 4.38 at Alabama's camp. And when I heard this, I ran to my huddle, because that's what we recruiting nerds do. I ran to my huddle, and I'm like, how can a kid that runs that fast be ranked where he's at? And then you watch the tape, and you're like, the rankings are too premature. And again, it's no one's fault. Don't point fingers. Don't go, oh, these guys are asleep at the wheel. It's not that at all. It's the vast job that it is, and the fact that the way that these rankings are put together is a process, and the process was completely obliterated by COVID, just like everything else in terms of how this works. So there's going to be a handful of players that are better than their rankings, and a handful of players that maybe get ranked a little high. And I'm a huge fan of what 24/7 has done over the years, and remain a massive fan. I think what they do is incredible and incredibly accurate under an impossible task. So, it just makes for interesting stuff. We should just all be interested in how all this works. Just don't be the guy out there thinking that what happens is a handful of people watch every single high school game that's played in the United States and then ranks every player that's on the field in every class and every classification in the U.S. And out of these, 64,000 kids playing high school football, there's some sort of way to rank them 1 through 64,000. That's not even remotely close to how this works. So it's just a great example of how, in the end, these rankings are incredibly helpful to us fans of football, and they mean a lot, and they're accurate. I mean, for instance, they rank Alabama number one in the recruiting rankings almost every year. Where does Alabama end up on the field rankings at the end of every year? Number one. So yeah, they're getting it right. They're getting it right, and just performing an impossible task. And that's how, at the end of this year, everybody all over the country is going to be talking about Kobe Prentice's Bama bump. No. He's just getting, for the first time, a real fair look on tape and what he does on the field, and getting the hype he probably should have been getting all along, but he just slipped through the cracks. And that's what makes him interesting. In terms of what he brings to the field, in terms of what I see on tape, I see a guy that plays to his speed. He is very fast. His pads do not slow him down. He runs a 4.4-ish 40 time. He plays to 4.4 speed on the field. And, the knocks on those guys that play wide receiver is that they're track guys and not football guys. And I think Henry Ruggs is a fantastic example of a guy with track times that proved in college that he was a football player. And that's going to be what the situation is with Kobe. Anybody that runs that fast is going to have to overcome this knock that he's a speed guy and not a football guy. But when I watch his tape at Calera, I see a kid with real football skills, a kid that knows how to get open, a kid that has hands you can work with. He's not big, but he's also not small. He's got a pretty decent frame to him. He's not one of these little tiny guys that runs that fast. I mean, he's got some legitimate speed to him. I came up with this comp earlier. It's only for you fellow old folks. You guys remember back in the early 90s or mid-90s, we had a dude we signed out of Niceville, Florida, named Marcel West. I think Kobe's a lot like him in the sense they're both very similarly sized with similar speed. And while Marcel didn't show up at Alabama, a 5+ star or leave Alabama as a first-round pick. He was a good player and was one of the fastest receivers. And I think with Kobe, that's what we're getting with him. He's going to show up and be the fastest guy in the wide receiver room, and or one of the fastest guys. And hey, once you show up like that, then it's up to Holman Wiggins and the Alabama coaches to develop him into a receiver. But hey, you can't teach some kid to run fast. They do that naturally out of the womb, or they'll never be players. So this kid is showing up with an A+ elite skill, and then it's up to Alabama to develop him into a dude. And what kind of track record does Alabama have with that? A really good one. So don't get confused by his early low ranking. It's going to be rising and rising and rising. And the only recruiting rankings that matter, people, the only one that matters is the recruiting ranking at the end. And I'm telling y'all right now, I think there's a chance that by the time this cycle has ended, Kobe Prentice is one of the top 5 or 6 prospects in the state of Alabama. That's probably where he really deserves to be. So good news for Alabama. Good news, and a heck of an addition to the receiving core. Alabama needs to sign probably 3 or 4 more guys in this group, and Alabama's kind of been on a roll at wide receiver, and I think Kobe Prentice is he's just continuing that role. I would look for Alabama again to add 2 or 3 more guys. I've got a Burrow crush on Barry and Brown from Tennessee. I sort of hope he's next. Appreciate you guys listening to the Locked On Bama podcast, and we'll be back soon.
A big trade shakes up the NBA draft. Here's what our local experts are locked on today. Let's start in college football, where reports are that the SEC will meet on Thursday to discuss adding the Oklahoma Sooners and Texas Longhorns. Today on Locked On Sooners, USA Today's John Williams takes you inside the meetings that Oklahoma had with their current conference, the Big 12. The Green Bay Packers continue to try and persuade Aaron Rodgers to return to the team, reportedly coming to terms on a number of concessions meant to entice the reigning NFL MVP. Our local expert in Green Bay, Peter Bukowski, has that and the latest on talks with star wide receiver Davante Adams. The Memphis Grizzlies have moved up in the NBA draft, acquiring the 10th overall pick from the New Orleans Pelicans. For more details on the deal, listen to our local expert in Memphis, Sean Coleman, on today's Locked On Grizzlies podcast. And for full live coverage of the NBA draft, subscribe to the Locked On NBA YouTube channel and tune in to Locked On NBA Draft 2021 on July 29th. Local experts on the biggest stories. It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This episode is brought to you by Spotify Green Room. Have you ever listened to a podcast like this one and you wanted to bring up your own point or just chat with other people that are listening at the same time? Well, let me tell you about Spotify Green Room. This is the first social audio platform made just for sports fans. The app is free to download, and once you're in, you can talk with us, other fans, athletes, insiders in real time about your favorite sport or team. Download the app, currently available on iOS devices. Create a profile, link your Twitter, join one of the groups for the latest league updates, and then you'll see us there. Spotify Green Room, changing the way we talk sports.